Right? Remember to thank your scientist. Next time you get a chance to thank a scientist. That'll be your new slogan for today.
Hi, I'm Adam,
Hi, I'm Mike.
and this is Poutine Politics, Canadian issues served with cheese curds. So this is our first episode, and what we're going to be covering today has to do with social media and censorship. Just obvious issues in regards to communication online and how conversation has become more argumentative, divisive between left and right. People calling each other snowflakes, people calling each other whatever word you want to use, whatever insult you want to use. And partially we feel where some people have the wrong idea, where some people have the right idea, and our thoughts on it. So that's what we're looking at talking about today. I have certain feelings on it. Mike has certain feelings on it as well.
Yeah, one of the big things that people need to realize is that freedom of speech is tricky to define, but you need to understand that freedom of speech doesn't say you get to say with whatever you want to without consequence. Generally speaking, the universal freedom of speech idea is, I'm free to express myself in a public forum. I'm free to have whatever thought I want to have, and the government can't come in and take it. I'm free to write about the government or vocalize myself about the government, and that's also fine too. Where the problems lie is people blur the line between a public forum, such as Facebook, and a public setting, such as a soapbox on the outside. So that's where people get confused. And there's also some confusion on freedom of speech too, where I don't know if you've encountered this, where people think that just because I say something somebody doesn't like, automatically means that, well, you're infringing on my freedoms.
And that's why I felt that this was one of the first things I wanted to talk about. One, because it's relatively current, and two, because I've been involved in some of those discussions / arguments / whatever you want to call them on Facebook, not from an insulting perspective or anything like that. Whenever I talk to people online or have some sort of conversation about this, whether in public, I try and be as respectful as possible. I don't want to call people idiots or snowflakes or whatever. I want to come across rational, and I feel that when people start using names and whatever, sometimes swearing. I mean, swearing is a regular thing, but there's ways that you can use it where it's in normal speech, and there's ways that you can use it where it's harmful. But not to get too far off from that. So the reason why I'm looking at, or why I found that freedom of speech, censorship, social media was important, because it was very recent. So what happened was a few weeks ago, in particular on YouTube, but Facebook and Twitter were also part of this, where certain groups had their accounts banned. Now, in a lot of cases, it turns out that a lot of those groups were what some could define as hate groups. Some would call them alt-right, neo-Nazi. And there are people that are supporters isn't really even the right word. There are people that see that kind of censorship and call it a violation of freedom of speech. And at least based on how freedom of speech is worded and how Mike described it, it's not freedom of speech that it's infringing upon. Could it be considered censorship? Sure, absolutely. I mean, the worst thing to do, in my eyes, is to shut someone out of the conversation. But at the same time, if someone is using what can be considered harmful, racist language, I don't have a problem with that being blocked, with that being stopped, because it's not appropriate and it's not conducive to a respectful environment.
Yeah, and Adam, why is it important that we distinguish the difference between a public setting and a private or a corporation, something like that, in their settings? Why have this distinction if it's all just words and things like that?
So the situation that I point to in regards to a public setting here, where people are allowed to essentially speak their mind in a public setting, and government, police, so on and so forth, they're not going to do anything to stop you. So I think back in 2017, there's the riots in Charlottesville, Virginia. So that was a small group of neo-Nazi supporters, what people are now or have been calling for the last few years alt-right. And there were counter-protesters that were involved in that situation as well, and this is partially the group that people have labeled as Antifa or anti-fascist. But they were allowed to protest somewhat peacefully. Obviously, we know there's other circumstances that happened there. Someone drove a car into the crowd, and someone was killed in that accident. And the people were still allowed to hold their protest, and the government wasn't stopping them. And some people point to Donald Trump's view on the whole situation and say, well, of course the government's not going to stop them because the government's supportive of them. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the fact that the people were allowed to protest peacefully. Okay? It's a public setting. Peaceful protest is allowed. When violence gets involved, I have no problem with the police getting in and separating it. Regardless of who starts the violence, stop the violence. Simple enough. From a business standpoint, so in the case of YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, banning these accounts. So it's not a violation of freedom of speech in this situation because they have specific terms of service and terms of use. And what they speak about in those terms of service has to do with, essentially anti-harassment, anti-bullying, that, some, if not all of these platforms do have language in there in regards to hate speech and racism, and that they don't allow it on their platforms. And so when you create an account and release content, whether it's just a post on your personal Facebook feed or you have videos that you release on YouTube and you're making money off of them, if you break their terms of service, they're well within their rights to block you from their platform because you've signed on to that agreement, which most people don't read when they make an account on one of these websites. And if you violate it, you're off. It's as simple as that. I have issues with it from a standpoint of censorship, but not from freedom of speech, because it's not violating freedom of speech in those circumstances.
So even though it is a public forum, which is why I mentioned that earlier, the meta situation is this. Listen, cut to the chase. If you want to put something on that makes somebody upset, even in the freedom of speech argument, you can belittle people and it's still fine as far as freedom of speech goes. Otherwise, you would never have any comedians. There were nobody coming up and saying anything because they couldn't say anything. Wait, that's not true. You could have Jerry Seinfeld. But other than Jerry Seinfeld, you could have no comedians. Richard Pryor would not even be allowed to be on stage. So when it comes to these things, you have to get to the point of Facebook limiting your access. Well, guess what? You put something on that nobody wants to hear. Or, sorry, not that nobody wants to hear. You put something up that is directly offensive. Cyberbullying is a thing. So that's the censorship guides. And their companies are going to take the political correct way of looking at things because they don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to be bogged down in lawsuits. They don't want to have to go back in front of Congress. They don't want to have to deal with every single tiny little country that has a problem with their censorship. They're just going to go, no, you can just get shut down. That's fine. You're 100 followers. Sorry about your luck. But the reality is you're just going to put a new account anyway and just start from scratch. So I don't know what it's really going to gain. That's another question for another day. The point is that if you're feeling like you're hurt because your freedoms are being stepped on, you need to think about reading the terms of service. If you want to get on a soapbox and go claim to everybody about everything, go ahead. See who listens. But I can guarantee you're not going to have as easy platform as on the internet.
Well, and what I think about too, even just from a local standpoint, maybe not specifically here where we live, but let's say down in Toronto. You're down in a public square in Toronto and wandering around with 50,000 other people. And you'll see those kinds of people around. They're carrying their placards, their big signs, whether it's a religious thing, whether it's a racial thing, whether it's whatever. Those people exist, in a public forum, and the people walking by might not like it. They might find it offensive. But those people are perfectly allowed to voice their opinion in that way. There's nothing that says that they can't. And as long as they're not being violent or belligerent, then nobody's going to stop them. And the person who's offended by it should really just walk away. Now, there's going to be the odd person that gets offended by it and may decide, okay, well, I'm going to pick a fight or I'm going to do whatever. And they shouldn't. But not everybody works that way. Some people have shorter tempers than others. You get talking to them and you really don't like what they're saying, and the next thing you know, you're throwing a punch. And that's where things get worse for you, even if you didn't agree or felt that what that person was saying was offensive. So, again, all we're saying here is freedom of speech. When it comes to the online things, when you're posting, yes, public forum, but it's on a public forum that is provided by a business, and if that business wants to shut down your access to that public forum because they believe that what you're doing is against what they're providing, they're well within their rights to do that. Now, my issue in this situation is censorship, because it is a situation of choosing who the right people or right groups are to block from these services. If I'm a left-leaning individual and I have certain beliefs that are on that side of the political spectrum, and a friend of mine posts a news article or something that they feel strongly about that is a right-wing belief, I shouldn't be able to just go there to report their post and say this is offensive to me and it shouldn't be allowed and it should be removed. I know that option is available on someone's Facebook post or Twitter post where you can report it, but I don't want those platforms to block people's postings because people get upset at what they're saying when it's really not offensive. You understand what I'm saying?
So do you mean that people take offense, and they take offense at anything because that's what they do? And if I were to say that, as a right-wing leaning person, that, I think tax cuts are good for the economy, and a left-wing person wants to report that, that's an abuse of power.
I think so. Especially if that reporting actually, let's say if that reporting led to the person's post being removed or their access to that platform being removed. I don't want censorship to the point of an entire political viewpoint being removed, not having an online platform. Because, as a voter, when I go to make my decision as to who I'm going to vote for, predominantly I'm looking at the platforms of the parties, but I got to have that open communication with people as well, because maybe my decision will be swayed based on conversations I have with people, because maybe reading the platform isn't enough. Well, we need to be able to have those conversations, again, without calling each other idiots or whatever. I worry about censorship in that, could a company like Facebook potentially, let's say if they had an election for board of directors, and the majority of the board of directors that were voted in were predominantly right-leaning. And so they decided that, we're going to change our terms of service, and anybody that posts anything with a left-leaning bias is automatically going to be removed, or it's going to be an auto report, or you're just not going to be allowed to post it, or something like that. That's obviously in a very extreme situation, but those are the kinds of things we need to avoid.
Moderators moderating. The other tricky part, too, is that a lot of the stuff is done by robots, and robots, they're not necessarily going to have the human nature. So if it's done by an algorithm, you may run into a situation where, the algorithm is trained that, if it gets voted on by 5 people, then it gets removed. Well, the algorithm is an algorithm. It's just a little bot trying to do its thing. It's not going to know that this is a real thing. This isn't like hate crime. This is just somebody having a different viewpoint. And far too often, you see people complaining about this, especially on YouTube, where they're like, my videos got taken down. The bot said it was. And, YouTube has an escalate process where it's going to go for a manual review. And it's like, is it really going for a manual review? Or do we get the super bot this time? You never know. And that's the thing. Like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, these big platforms, they don't have the time to manually review it. They just don't. Like, there's just too many. Like, there's 1 billion hours worth of YouTube being watched every day. You think they have time that somebody's going through and clicking through it? Nobody's going through that.
And there's something about YouTube as well, where it's a certain number of days worth of videos that get uploaded every minute.
Oh yeah,
it's a ridiculous amount. And again, like you said, there's no way that you can't have a team large enough that could review everything before it goes online to say, oh, that shouldn't be allowed, or for people to review videos that are already online and say, oh, that video shouldn't be allowed. I guess the problem is that these platforms take that blanket approach and say, if enough people are reporting a post by this person, or enough people are reporting the person or the group in general, rather than looking through all of the material to really see where the problem is, they take enough of an approach of, okay, if enough people are complaining, we're just going to turn it off. We're just going to shut them down, and that's it. And the problem is, there may not be any other way to do it, but it doesn't make it right.
Yeah, and there's a danger in censorship. So it's the whole idea, like, you have people like that are flat earthers. And if you really believe the earth is flat, I suggest you going to the Antarctic wall, climb it, and jump off the edge. Just make life easier for everybody. We're good. Because I'm pretty sure that's how they work. They think that the entire world is surrounded by a big wall of ice, and that's how it works. Then there are people on the other side of the spectrum, or other views, like the conspiracy theories. And conspiracy things go both ways. Like, don't make me think that, it's just one way. There's also people that don't believe climate change isn't real. Well, all right, that's fine. You go invest all your money in the Florida Keys, and we'll be fine. Like, you put your money where your mouth is, because I don't think you're going to, right? There is a president, we shall remain nameless, that lays claim that climate change isn't real, but somehow has put money into making sure his golf resorts don't get flooded. Yeah, okay, dude. Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah, you're right on par. You're right on point. So
remember, he doesn't just say that it's not real. He says it's a Chinese hoax.
Oh, right. Sorry, my apologies. It's Chinese hoax. My apology. I didn't know my conspiracy theories. I'm not up to speed on them. So those things are at the very core of false. However, do they need censorship? And then you start going down this well of, where do you put the stopping point, right? Like, is it there? Is it somewhere else? And censorship becomes a really big problem when you go down that well, where people are promoting clearly the majority of scientific proof. I don't mean just the majority of people, because I don't think just because you have a majority of people believing something doesn't mean it's right. However, if you have a majority of experts doing it, then you probably should really consider it. When 97% of scientists believe that climate change is a thing, I'm gonna go with scientists. They're the ones that make my cell phone work, so I'm good with that. They know a lot more than me. Like, the little cell phone goes bing bing, and I'm like, oh, I got a text message from my wife. That's great, fantastic. You're smarter than me. Okay, let's continue to trust you people, because I don't know how it works. So
it's as simple as that, everybody. The cell phone goes bing bing, and it works, and it's the scientists.
It's the scientists. Right? Remember to thank your scientists. Next time you get a chance to, thank a scientist. That'll be in your slogan for today. The danger of censorship is that, and YouTube has started censoring this, where someone will put up a crackpot conspiracy theory video. The moon landings didn't happen. Like, the idea of those things being true, and then YouTube will put up the real articles about these things. Well, that's a form of censorship, right? It's a slippery slope. Like, where does it stop? Where does it go from being a conspiracy theory to kind of a conspiracy theory to maybe it's not, maybe it, and where do you draw the line? And I hate the idea of absolution where it has to be either on or off. I live like Grace. I love dials as far as things go, and too often in politics, I'm either for something or I'm against something. Well, you don't have to be either. You can be in the middle. Like that's such a thing. Like,
and you know what? From my point of view, with things like conspiracy theory videos, let's say, I look at it kind of like television. You'll get some entertainment out of it. When I'm watching TV, if I don't like what I'm watching, I'll turn it off. But I'm generally watching something, or I'm watching it for entertainment purposes. I'll watch some of those conspiracy theory videos because, you know what? Those people have got creative minds. Some of the stuff they are saying obviously may not be real, but it's entertaining. And if it entertained me for 20 minutes or however long a video happens to be, or so on a podcast, I'll listen to it. But it isn't necessarily going to change my mind. Where I want to bring the censorship issue, or I guess where some people are worried about a potential censorship issue from a Canadian perspective, has to do with some things that were announced in the budget back in the winter. Back in March, when the Liberals released the federal budget, there was a portion of that budget that has to do with journalism. And it has to do with money to partially to help newspaper companies with the fact that they are losing revenues. They're losing customers, and they didn't jump on the online bandwagon fast enough, or when they did, they offered everything for free, and they've tried to switch to subscription models. Most of them are on subscription models now, but it took them a long time to get there. They're losing ad revenue, and so they were looking for a way. They've been lobbying the government for some sort of tax break, subsidy, and they got that in the budget. So there's a few different parts to it. One has to do with the individual. So let's say if I go on the Globe and Mail and I register for a subscription with them, assuming that they're chosen as a qualified journalism source, which I would imagine the Globe and Mail would be, I can get a tax credit for the fact that I subscribe to them. At the same token, the newspaper companies will have a fund that they can access based on, or that will help them. It's supposed to help with journalistic integrity and to, blank out fake news and so on and so forth. That's kind of the language. The concerns that I've read recently about these changes, about these rules coming into place, is the government did also just make a notification about the organizations that are going to choose who these qualified journalism companies are. Now, I imagine that every single major newspaper organization in the country is going to be on that list of viable news outlets. As a story in the Financial Post mentioned back in March when the budget came out, is Post Media. And if you know enough about newspapers in the country, Post Media is relatively right-leaning. They're the company that owns papers like the Toronto Sun, Vancouver Sun, Ottawa Sun. So the ones that some people label as right-wing tabloid, but they also own the National Post, and the National Post is viewed as a predominantly right-wing newspaper. Again, I mean, it depends on your viewpoint. If you actually read it often enough, you probably notice that something like the National Post has a little bit more of both sides of the spectrum, but maybe it does slightly have a right lean to it with the journalists that do write stories in it. So the concern that I read from certain, I'd say more like bloggers and independents, is that this is a way that the Liberals can use that funding and use this program and use the groups, the independent journalism groups, to make choices that will censor, or well, censor's not the right word, I guess, in this situation, but potentially the funding wouldn't go to certain right-wing organizations or what the government or these independent organizations view as right-wing. And so what they're saying is, well, with the election coming up in October, we're not going to be able to get out our viewpoint on things, and as a result, the public is going to have more left-leaning, liberal-leaning information to digest. And they feel like it's censorship of conservative-leaning viewpoints, and two, it's buying votes.
Yeah, there's always a way to buy votes. You want to know, you want to follow politics, you follow the money. The money always leads to where you need to go. Getting more back on to the freedom of speech and the social media aspect too. The other things that I come across is I'll see all the time. Well, I say this, and I have the right because I have free speech. Yeah, you have the right to free speech. You don't have the right to freedom from consequences. What that means, if you say something stupid, I can call you stupid. It also means that if you say something hurtful to somebody, if I say, in a public forum, or not a public forum, in a public space, I say something like that you take offense to for whatever reason, as long as it's not deemed hateful, like I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis, and saying, the Holocaust, denied the Holocaust, or something absolutely crazy like that, as long as I say something to the effect of, your orange shirt looks terrible, and you shouldn't have been out in public in it, because, really, orange? Then that's okay. That's fine. Guess what? You got belittled. Suck it up, buttercup. Somebody's allowed to tell you that. There's nothing wrong with that, right? So you're not going to get it. That's a freedom of speech thing. Now, can you get in trouble with libel and defamation and things like that as a result of that? Yeah. You can get in trouble with harassment? Yes. But that's not freedom of speech. And online, people like to think, oh, I said whatever I want to and I'm allowed to. Well, yeah, you're allowed to, but I can still call you stupid. It's fine.
I feel like my get off my lawn comment on this, or the old man yells at cloud comment on this, is times have changed. What people find offensive has changed over time, or at least, from my perspective. Yeah, when someone made fun of me when I was in public school, I got upset. Telling a teacher, telling a parent, but nothing severe was done about it. It's not like they suspended that kid for 5 minutes because he made fun of the fact that I tripped in the schoolyard, or because he said I had a funny nose. Nobody. It wasn't that severe, and I don't want to lessen when people do feel legitimately offended. I feel like we have to draw the line a little different, because I feel like it's too easy to get offended. And we almost, as a society, need to back up a step and rethink where that line is. Because it's okay to get offended at a certain level or at a certain point, but not necessarily because someone doesn't agree with you. If they insult you in the process, yeah, okay, I understand being offended by it, but we shouldn't fly off the handle. I think that's kind of the end of my piece on that.
The other thing too is that if somebody's insulting your opinion, it's your opinion. You're allowed to change your opinion too, because my opinion, I look back 5 years ago and I look at some of my opinions and go, what were you thinking? This is why I don't have a tattoo, because I look at some of the things I would have gotten 5 years ago and I would have been like, well, why did you do that? Why did you think My Little Ponies were going to be the greatest thing in the world? Like, nobody cares about your Pinkie Pie.
I remember your brony situation with, like, was it even with your kids?
Yeah, my kids are over. They don't even care about My Little Pony anymore. Like, it'd be like, well, that's great. Now I got a Pinkie Pie tattoo on my leg. You want to hear all about my brony situation? I still like My Little Ponies. Shh. But I'm not into it like I used to be. I'll say that. So, your opinions can change. How you feel about things can change. And if you're going to have a discussion online, make it about the opinion. Don't make it about the person. Like, just
I think what Mike's trying to say there is we've reached the end of this episode. So, thank you for listening. My name's Adam.
My name's Mike.
And you've been listening to Poutine Politics. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Poutine Politics. Be sure to keep up with us online and through social media. Our website is poutinepolitics.ca. You can find us on Facebook at Poutine Politics. You can find us on Instagram at Poutine Politics. You can find us on Twitter at Politics Poutine, because Twitter thought we were French. We're on YouTube, and we've also started a Patreon page at Patreon, patreon.com/PoutinePolitics. We hope we've entertained you enough that you can show us some love. We'll be back next week with another episode.